Over to you whenever you're ready, Kern.
Thank you. Good morning. Straight away, what I'm going to do is apologise for the sound of roadworks in the background. We have a very busy road outside, and they've decided to do some work on it straight away. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the otherness of the rural working class from the Wicker Man to the third day. So let's get going. And what's that? That's exactly 10, so quarter past. Brilliant. When watching Felix Barrett and Dennis Kelly's TV series, The Third Day, you can be forgiven for assuming at first that it's just a modernization of The Wicker Man. I'm not going to talk too much about The Wicker Man. We did a lot of that already, but just to contextualize it within my argument, it is the story of Sergeant Howie, police officer, travelling to the remote Scottish island of Summerisle after receiving a letter about the disappearance of a local girl. On the island, he finds a cult, this kind of joyful, liberal, and sort of openly erotic, pagan-influenced community who delight in obstructing his investigation. In the end, he is burnt to death in a giant wooden man, as we all know and love. Third Day, on the other hand, is a television series that came out a couple of years back, and it's structured really interestingly. It's split into 3 different sections. So part 1 is called Summer, and this is remarkably similar to The Wicker Man. It stars Jude Law here, playing a man called Sam, who is a middle-class, sort of supposedly enlightened figure who is drawn to a remote island to save a young girl. The island of Ossie is populated by a community of people who worship old paganish gods, and he doesn't fare particularly well from his time there. It's a familiar tale. After those 3 episodes, you get a section called Autumn, which is a 12-hour live-streamed Facebook event, which was produced by Punch Drunk Theatre Company, the people who do all the sort of site-specific theatre. And then after that, there was a 3rd section called Winter, which is set 9 months after summer and autumn, and it depicts Helen, played by Naomi Harris, who travels to Ossie as well with her 2 young daughters, and she finds the island amid a civil war as the residents are sort of fighting over who should control the land. She also becomes trapped by the flooded causeway, and she has to fight to protect her daughters and investigate a missing case of her own. It's really interesting. It's like 9 months after The Wicker Man, what would happen if everything descended into chaos. It's a good show. But as the third day progresses, it becomes apparent that its sort of key contributions to the folk horror canon are found in the places where it diverges from The Wicker Man, and therefore the kind of established folk horror genre. Here are 2 screen caps there from The Third Day and The Wicker Man to kind of illustrate their visual similarities. The Third Day proudly wears its inspirations on its sleeve, while simultaneously questioning the ease at which we accept the genre's more difficult aspects. In particular, what I'm going to talk about today is its representation of rural working classes as sort of inherently violent people and a cultural other. This is a screenshot from the 12-hour live streamed event, which is essentially just 12 hours of torturing Jude Law. It's worth a watch if you're into that sort of thing. But further, the Third Day, it experiments with folk horror form and narrative structure. It teamed up with Punch Drunk, of which Felix Barrett, one of the show's writers, is the artistic director, to create this sort of event called Esus in the Sea, in which Sam must complete a day-long trial called the Path of Esus, which will supposedly rid the world of evil. By combining fictional folk horror with genuine on-site folk celebration, The Third Day is blurring the boundaries between reality and fiction. But in this paper, I'll be analysing and comparing one such key difference between these 2 folk horror products, and that's the depiction of otherness and the idea that folk horror fiction presents its members of rural communities as inherently barbaric. I'll be reading the representations of the islanders in these 2 properties to ascertain whether there's been a kind of upholding of Wicker Man's difficulties or an eroding of it over the decades that have gone since. So I'll do a little bit about The Wicker Man, but not too much, I promise. While not the first folk horror film, The Wicker Man is arguably the film that perfected what Adam Scoville, tick him off your bingo cards, called incredibly subjectivist and flexible folk horror form. And its influence on not only folk horror, but the entire horror genre in general cannot be understated, with some critics here calling it the most significant British horror film. It makes The Unholy Trinity, tick that one off too, alongside Witchfinder General and The Blood on Satan's Claw, which is 3 films that define a folk horror narrative. In actuality, the folk horror genre is far broader than this. It contains contributions from across the world and across forms and across centuries, as we've seen so far this weekend already. And the 3 films that comprise the trilogy are very good at defining a certain type of folk horror, that is British folk horror films made from 1968 onwards. But luckily for me and for this paper, The Third Day does fall within this comparatively thin category. So, for Scoville and for many others after him, these films can be included within the folk horror subgenre because they're constructed by these linking set of narrative traits that have a causational and interlinking consequences. This is the folk horror chain. A lot of people have talked about the folk horror chain already, but if you've not come across it yet, essentially it's these 4 bullet points that I've got on the screen now: the landscape, the sense of isolation, this isolation creating a skewed belief system or morality of the peoples therein, and then ultimately culminating in this sort of hyper-violent happening or a summoning. This paper, I'm going to focus on the interlinking nature of these things and how, by structuring it as a chain, Scoville is placing an emphasis on the causal nature of the links. The landscape creates the isolation, which in turn facilitates the skewed beliefs and so on. It's a deterministic narrative structure, which is supposed to heighten the horror of the film. Scoville says there's no return for Howie once the chain has been enacted and lived through. Its conclusion of primitive violence or summoning of evil is inevitable. In folk horror fiction, the simple act of entering a rural landscape becomes an inexorable march towards one's own death. While this sense of unavoidable doom is signature of folk horror fiction, it also suggests an unbreakable connection between rural spaces, the people that live there, and violent ritual murder, and therefore has the effect of presenting rural communities as problematic and violent spaces. Scoville does anticipate this reading somewhat, and when explaining the nuances of skewed morals and belief systems, he does say that there is a lot of potential in the community on Summer Isle. He says that their skewed morality isn't their liberal agenda or pagan religion. He says it's in fact their kind of blindness and complicity towards Howie's death, rather than the other things. And he's correct. There's been loads of writing since The Wicker Man about the politically and socially progressive aspects of the Summer Isle community, which often connects it to the real world countercultural movements of 60s Britain. However, what the majority of this scholarship misses, and I've been really excited to see that a couple of papers yesterday also picked up on this, is that Summer Isle is not just a countercultural liberal community. While some of the island's residents do sort of fashion themselves after these hippie movements or hold a similar politics, Summer Isle is also a working class rural community comprised of fishermen, farmers, and the gardeners who work on Lord Summer Isle's land. Any problematic representations of the paganism and the free love of Summer Isle extends to the lifestyles of these people too, and folk horror scholarship has tended to have missed that. The folk horror chain is a narrative structure that enacts a process of othering in its connection of rural, non-Christian and non-capitalistic communities with an inevitable lust for violence and murder, which has the effect of representing these people as, and this is a quote from Robin Wood, all that our society represses or oppresses. They're an object of horror and a matter for terror. For some, this othering of rural communities is not simply exploitative, but a deliberate attempt to further disconnect an already disconnected people. In an essay from, which some of you will remember actually from the Falmouth Folk Horror Conference, it's called A Fear of the Folk, Ontopophobia and the Horror of Rural Landscapes. James Thurgill says that folk horror presents us with this spatial politics that further alienates rural communities from the contemporary mainstream, and it imagines them as enclaves of ignorance and social, cultural, and political stagnation. For Thurgill, the broad strokes of the folk horror chain are symptomatic of folk horror's dismissive and problematic attitudes bleeding over into the scholarship on the subject. The conflation of landscape and rurality ignores the nuances of these spaces and kind of paints them all with the same brush. It occludes the dynamic agency of landscape and the production of topophobia on which the subgenre is built. So when you watch The Third Day, it becomes apparent after a while that Kelly and Barrett, the show's creators, are aware of this. And instead of ignoring this topophobia or trying to remove it entirely and just pretend it didn't exist, they instead update it. And instead of focusing on the kind of Wicker Man countercultural iconography, they center the working rural classes on the island of Ossie. Slide change, there we go. So The Third Day opens with Sam, played by Jude Law, and he's floating a child's t-shirt down a wooded river. We're later told that his infant son Nathan has been murdered, and it's Sam's personal ritual that every year he commits another article of Nathan's clothing to the water where his body was found. On the way back to his car, he stumbles across a young girl named Epona, played by Jessie Ross, who's attempting to hang herself from a tree. Horrified, he drives her home via the causeway to the island of Ossie, where he becomes trapped by the tide. We learn later that Sam's son was killed by a Romanian asylum seeker, supposedly, and after finding newspaper clippings relating to his son's death on the island, he decides to stay and investigate the ways in which this place is connected to his past. Sam you can compare him to Sergeant Howie here. Sergeant Howie's revulsion of the pagans on the island and how he's horrified that they don't worship a Christian god, connected to Sam's kind of initial tolerance of their religion, when he's explained how they worship Isis rather than Jesus. There's kind of a mishearing joke. And he's explained to be a Celtic war god, and Sam just kind of smiles and nods and lets them talk about it for a bit. We later learn that while Sam is here presenting himself as politically progressive, he holds a deep-seated hatred towards Romanian men, which he justifies by connecting them to his son's Romanian murderer. He says publicly, don't blame immigrants, don't blame them. But on the inside, I just had to see a Roma man and I get this blind rage. So here The Third Day is engaging with a moral panic of its time by placing, by placing the subjects of that panic in the position of the villain in the same way that the Wicker Man did. So for the Wicker Man, it was countercultural figures of the 60s, but here it's that kind of right-wing tabloid narrative of the murderous Eastern European immigrant. To just go back to Robin Wood here, he defines this process in psychoanalytical terms, saying that central to the horror genre is the actual dramatization of the dual concept of the repressed, the other, in the figure of the monster. Sam later admonishes his own racism. He knows that it's wrong that he holds these beliefs, but he still can't shake them. So on The Third Day, it can be said to update the topophobia found within folk horror in this way. There we go. So after exploring the island for a while, Sam comes across Larry, played by John Dalglish, and Jason, played by Mark Lewis-Jones. They're both local working class men whose jobs on the island fall somewhere between general maintenance and violent henchmen. When Larry's introduced, he's in a fit of rage, as we can see in the screenshot, smashing detritus on a beach with a metal hammer while shouting a tirade about the leader of the island, who's called the Father. This dialogue foregrounds the internal conflict on the island that later explodes into like full civil war in the winter section. But it's also a sort of difficult articulation of class struggle in the UK. On the one hand, Larry is conscious of top-down power structure on the island, and he seems motivated to change it, but his rage is impotent and ineffectual. He's just smashing rubbish on a beach. Here, we see how Ossie separates entirely from the Wicker Man in its use of isolation, or its lack thereof. Summer Isle is a completely disconnected land, geographically, spiritually, and economically. In line with Leary's famous countercultural statement, the residents have truly dropped out of society. In The Third Day, however, Ossie shares this geographical separation from the British Isles, but is economically and philosophically still a part of them. In fact, if the characters are to be believed, it's the centre of economic prosperity in the world. Much like the Wicker Man, the islanders of Ossie are offering an outside individual to an ancient god in order to receive a bountiful harvest. For Summerisle, this was for their own prosperity and their own apples. But for OC, which is a somewhat modern island, not fully isolated from the UK, there's an interesting metaphor here with the causeway sometimes being there and sometimes not. Their economic connection is more than that. The islanders believe that OC is the soul of the world and that their oyster harvest must prosper in order for the world to be healed. One of the characters says, if the soul of the world is sick, then so is the world. The violent acts on OC have global ramifications. The island isn't isolated from global concerns, as Sokova's chain says is necessary for folk horror, but instead it's the centre point of global concerns. Thurgill speaks of the true horror of rural landscapes, which he defines as a problem created by neoliberal capitalism. He says the horror exists, in other words, in shrinking rural economies and the closure of primary resources such as hospitals, doctors' surgeries, libraries, and schools. The third day explicitly refers to this true horror, and the rest of the familiar folk horror chain, the skewed moral beliefs and the violent happening, are in response to this. The third day is a depiction of a rural working class community not only bearing the brunt of the failures of global capitalism, but internalizing the belief that they are the cause of these problems and are murdering each other in an attempt to fix them. To conclude, because I realise I've hit my 15 minutes, the third day is a fascinating updating of the Wicker Man. Its representation of rural working class communities both acknowledges and subverts the othering effects of the folk horror chain and the genre itself. But in saying this, it's not content to just depict the rural working class as victims of a socio-political structure. It complicates this idea further with Winter, which brings in new writers Kit de Waal and Dean O'Loughlin, in addition to Dennis Kelly. Here we see Helen arrive on the island. She's a black single mother with 2 daughters, and her interactions with the rural spaces and the people therein are profoundly different from Sam's. She's suspicious of the people she meets, and they're suspicious of her. She's denied entry to her holiday cottage that she's booked, she believes, on racial grounds, and her car is stolen. Even the way this section is shot, it's muted and sharp focus to contrast the kind of bright swimming visuals that you can see here. The writers of the third day are not depicting simplistic socio-economic structures. There isn't anything as easy as the oppressor-oppressed dynamic that can be read into Howie and the Summer Islanders, whichever way you want to choose that to go. By having OC economically connected to a wider world, the third day shatters the links with the folk horror chain, and in its place introduces something new to the genre, a neoliberal capitalism that permeates and destroys any notion of isolation. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to some questions.